Hello, World Economic News for Friday. Okay, we're going to go to the Eurozone to start with, and something a bit complicated, and this is why I've put it first. It's Martin Wolf, Intolerable Choices for the Eurozone, and he opens with the first four lines. His normal line that he's maintained for years: the Eurozone as designed has failed. It was based on a set of principles that have proven unworkable at the first contact with a financial and fiscal crisis. Financial is the banks, fiscal is the sovereign debt crisis. It has only two options: to go forwards towards a closer union, with Germany paying for everything, or backwards, at least partial dissolution. In other words, the Eurozone breaks up and they go at least the peripheral countries go back to their old currencies, drachma, etc., punt. This is what is at stake. Okay, right, we move on to the body of the article, and we get Professor Sin makes three other points. We'll forget the start of that and who Professor Sin is. You can read the article if you want to know. First, this backdoor way of financing debtor countries cannot continue for very long, and already this needs explanation, and this is why I put it first, because this explanation is a little bit complicated. This backdoor way of financing debtor countries cannot continue for very long. Should we finish this? By shifting so much of the Eurozone's money creation towards indirect finance of deficit countries, the system has had to withdraw credit from commercial banks in creditor countries. Don't worry, I'll try and explain. Within 2 years, he states, the latter will have negative credit positions with their own national central banks. In other words, be owed money by them. In other words, the commercial banks are lending the central banks money. Now, how can this possibly be? What the hell's going on? What it comes to pass happens is, in this weird world that we live in, this banking system in Europe, let's say we have two banks now. Which one's this? Wiggles finger. This is Ireland over here. Ireland, a deposit goes from an Irish bank to a German bank. So the German bank has the choice to accept the IOU or not. And normally it'll say, no, let's do this between our central banks. So the deposit goes up to the central banks, the Irish Central Bank and the Bundesbank. And what happens to the Irish Central Bank accepts the fact that it owes the Bundesbank, let's say, €50. Could be 50,000, could be 50 million, doesn't matter. €50. Okay, and that's just in their ledgers. And they pass that information up to the ECB, the divine authority in central banking in Europe, the ECB. Now the ECB notes this and notes whatever else has happened in that day. Now this was 50 going from Ireland over to Germany, but there might have been, say, 2 tens, it's unlikely, but the 2 tens going from Germany over to Ireland. And the ECB will net these out and just say, in the end, at the end of that day, we've got 30. Ireland Central Bank owes Bundesbank 30. But what it does then is say, I will take these on board. The Irish Central Bank owes me 30 and I owe the Bundesbank 30. Okay? So that's the way it goes, from banks up to their individual central banks and along and up to the ECB. I'll go on these. I'll do second and third from this list and then go to a chart. Second, the only way to stop them without a crisis is for solvent governments to take over what are, in essence, fiscal operations. Fiscal is government. And this, let's say, central banking shenanigans, if it is shenanigans, these debts that are owed are technically really owed by the governments and not the banks or central banks, because this is happening because the banks haven't got the money. Third, when one adds the sums owed by national central banks to the debts of national governments, totals are now frighteningly high. See chart. We will go to the chart. The only way out is to return to a situation in which the private sector finances both banks and the governments. but this will take many years if it can be done with today's huge debt levels at all. We'll forget that financing part and go to totals are now frighteningly high, and the fact that governments really have to accept these interbanking shenanigans as their own. So let's go to this chart. Should be 1C. Top left, intra Eurosystem debt. That's what we're looking at here. This is the banking shenanigans, intra Eurosystem debt. Now let's start in the middle. Finland is just positive to the central bank system. Just below, France is just negative, but it's 30 billion negative. That's an awful lot of negative, even for France. That's big money, 30 billion. Netherlands is positive, Luxembourg's positive, and the classic people are negative down below. France, Spain, Portugal, Greece. But look what these numbers are. 50 billion, 60 billion for Portugal. 60 billion is a wampum a lot of money for Portugal. And Greece, 87 billion. But Ireland, 146 billion. That is twice the amount of the official bailouts. And who's paying for it all? At the top, Germany. So go over to the top right-hand chart, if you would, and you can see that the red line is the German positive being owed by the central bank, or what is owed to the Bundesbank. And you can see it goes up to that number, 325 billion. And the blue line is the negatives from Greece, Ireland, Portugal and Spain. What you can basically see is the Bundesbank is bailing out Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain's banking system and overall system to that extra amount of 325 billion. And as Sin says, this is really to be accepted by Merkel's government on behalf of the people who will have to pay that. And if we drop down to the bottom right-hand part of this chart, we can see when we add these central banking shenanigans in, Spain goes up a bit. I thought Spain was a bit funny, but we'll leave that out. And Portugal goes to 180% of debt to GDP. Greece and Ireland well over 200% of debt to GDP, just like Japan, but with none of the positives that Japan has. Okay, bit complicated, but you can see it's an extra depth to the Eurozone problem, and Wolf says, and he's always stuck to it and will maintain it, that basically Germany has to pay for all of this, and even extra things that you'd say, well, France has got to take its France can't afford these things. Either Germany basically pays for most all of it, or the Eurozone is going to fall apart. Now, it looks like in the background, Germany is accepting it via the Bundesbank and will have to ultimately accept to pay for an awful lot more of this. Or the euro as a currency falls apart. Move on to something easy. Oh no, we'll just move past this. Lancaster University, John Whittaker is obviously the paper that Martin Wolf based a lot of the information from that article on. So if you want to go into the depth of what's happening there, the John Whittaker Lancaster University paper PDF is the next link, and that's your background information if you're up to it this weekend. Over to the United States, where we're safe, and we got the PMI yesterday, and we look at everything and it all went very negative, and this is why the stock market went negative, and there was a bad ADP employment number came out, and we can see down the middle percentage point changes, and just about everything is negative. Minus 6.9, minus 10.74 new orders, absolutely shocking. Production down, minus 9.8, nearly 10%. That's moving down. They're still in anything over 50 in the series index number is still positive, but it's moved down so much that a lot of them are only just positive now. This is from Pragmatic Capitalism, showing that prices paid is down 9 as well, 9%, but that's down from 85 down to 76. And as I say, anything over 50 is positive. Prices paid are still very, very high, but what PragCap's saying is that don't get too carried away with this inflation idea. The prices paid are falling back as well. Okay, move on to our friend Paul Krugman. Bubble debt denial. New York Times, of course. For a project I'm working on, I went back to the famous 2004 speech in which Alan Greenspan not only denied that there was a national housing bubble, but denied that it was even possible to have a national housing bubble. What I somehow never realized, however, is that the speech was actually largely devoted to poo-pooing concerns about household debt. Here is what was actually happening, and in chart 4b we can see this is household debt as a percentage of disposable household income. In 1950 it was something like 35%. You earn 100,000, I know it would have been an awful lot back then, and you owe 35,000. And it moved up through 100%. In other words, the household was taking in 100,000 and it owed 100,000, and it moved up to 130% of debt to the household income. But for me, I think Krugman's, it's unfair to have a go at Greenspan, because that number was always going up. So why should Greenspan say this is the particular time that it's unsustainable? It was unsustainable when it became unsustainable, and we can see when that was in 2008, and it is going down and down. And this is where we've got to agree with Cullen from PragCap. This is hugely deflationary. I'll leave it there. That is hugely deflationary, that chart there. 4B. Hugely deflationary. And the rest of the world now slowing down is hugely deflationary, because it means the growth isn't getting put in, the expectations aren't being met, and that means that natural thing that people do is borrowing to the extent of their expectations will not, so those debts will not be paid back, or a percentage won't be. And each percentage that isn't, that's deflationary. What else did I want to do? There's a link to a PDF now at number 5. It's Morgan Stanley doing UK economics and banks, with a paper entitled Why We Think UK House Prices Will Fall 10%. And then when they do, Lloyds Bank will be most exposed, if you're interested in reading that. A couple of world news pieces to finish with. International Business Times gives us Ivory Coast secures 130 million loan deal with the IMF. You remember the Côte d'Ivoire, where we had Laurent Gbagbo, who's the tribal hick that was meant to be voted out. He had his supporters, and Alassane Ouattara was the UN people said he had won the election, and as you can see, he's the one with the suit and the connections. And the UN drove the hick Gbagbo out and installed Ouattara. So Ouattara gets his 130 million loan deal from the IMF because he's connected, probably still has connections from the time in the past when he used to work for the IMF. BBC News, Middle East, Egypt virginity tests decried. Activists have demanded authorities in Egypt prosecute anyone responsible for subjecting protesters to alleged virginity tests earlier this year. We read in the article, the human rights group said 18 female protesters arrested after army officers cleared Tahrir Square on March the 9th were detained, beaten and given electric shocks. Of these, 17 were subjected to strip searches, forced to submit to virginity tests, and threatened with prostitution charges. You're a prostitute if you're not a virgin, if you're not married, of course. At the time, the military, which had been running Egypt since Hosni Mubarak was toppled in February, denied the allegations. So this is after Mubarak. This is the military when they were in charge. But on Tuesday, an unnamed general told CNN that tests were in fact carried out. The girls who were detained were not like your daughter or mine, said the general. These girls who had camped out in tents with male protesters. Now I've put this in just to show that the world is changing extremely quickly. As individuals, we can keep up with it the best we can. But institutions, many institutions, are very, very slow to change and are not keeping up at all. Have a good weekend. Bye.